Welcome to Shadows of Tinseltown, where we explore the real stories that the studio system tried to bury.
You see, Maggie, the problem with the $1,000,000 Mermaid moniker isn't just the hyperbole, it's the physics. We like to imagine Esther Williams just materialized in a pool of chlorinated water, fully formed and smiling, as if she were a natural occurrence, a biological miracle of the mid-century, meant to soothe a nation recovering from the trauma of the front lines.
Most people do. To the public, she was the ultimate Technicolor dream. Clean, athletic, the girl next door who just happened to be able to hold her breath for 4 minutes. She was the mid-century ideal of health and wholesomeness, the sanitized, aquatic antidote to the cigarette smoke and shadows of the noir fatale. She represented a post-war America that was literal and transparent, not shadowy. She was the American mermaid during an era when the country needed to see itself as invincible and radiant. Are you going to tell me the water was actually cold?
Cold? That would be a mercy. Cold is a sensation. What she endured was a structural hazard. No, Maggie, let's look at the crime scene. MGM's Stage 30. In 1944, they spent $250,000 in wartime currency to build a 90-foot square tank, 20 feet deep. It wasn't a swimming pool. It was an industrial set designed to look like a dream and function like a factory. They had to heat it, of course, to keep the actors from turning blue on film. But the steam from the warm water would fog the Technicolor lenses, which were notoriously temperamental and expensive to repair. These cameras, specifically the massive Big Bertha rigs, required immense amounts of light, and any condensation on the glass ruined a shot that cost thousands in film stock and labor.
So they were caught between the actor's hypothermia and the camera's mechanics. It's a literal battle between biology and optics.
Exactly. So, what did they do? They lowered the temperature until it was just above freezing. They kept her in a state of near hypothermia for 12 hours a day so the camera could stay clear. Imagine the caloric burn of trying to maintain a graceful, romantic smile while your core temperature is dropping into the danger zone and your extremities are going numb. And then there were the arc lights. Hundreds of them, suspended directly over the water to penetrate the depths for that crystal-clear clarity. 3-strip Technicolor had an incredibly low ASA. It needed the blazing sun to see anything underwater. The heat from those lights was so intense it could blister skin, yet feet away, the water was ice. If a single one of those heavy rigs had fallen, Stage 30 would have become a giant, electrified coffin. It was a high-voltage nightmare disguised as a summer lagoon.
And the noise? Between the pumps and the lights, it must have been deafening. How did they even coordinate the dance?
That's the forensic detail that gets me. They installed massive underwater speakers, vibrators really, so the swimmers could feel the beat of the music through their rib cages. It wasn't about hearing a melody. It was about tactile synchronization. If the vibrations were off by a millisecond, the biological machine broke. They were literally vibrating these women into a state of rhythmic compliance. If you watch the films closely, you aren't seeing joy. You're seeing a high-stakes response to mechanical stimuli.
So the glow wasn't just health. It was a literal physiological reaction to freezing temperatures, chemical exposure, and mechanical vibration. She was basically a biological heater for a corporate asset.
Precisely. And the choreography? It wasn't dance as we know it. It was a military drill performed in a liquid medium. To get those shots of her diving through circles of fire or emerging from fountains, they had to rig hydraulic lifts that could literally crush a person. In Texas Carnival, she was surrounded by dozens of orange-clad swimmers performing a sequence that required the timing of a Swiss watch. The stagehands were more like construction foremen, and the mermaids were essentially underwater miners. They were drilling for glamour in a pressurized environment. Consider the fountain sequences. Those weren't simple decorative spouts. They were high-pressure jets that could displace a human lung or break a rib if you swam into the wrong stream at the wrong angle. It was a choreography of avoidance, not just swimming. One wrong stroke, and you were a workplace safety statistic.
And what about the other girls, the synchronized swimmers? They look so uniform, like a biological machine. It's haunting when you look at them as a collective rather than individuals.
The school. They were the expendable infantry. In Pagan Love Song, they had them swimming in a lagoon where the current was so strong they had to be tied together with piano wire just to keep the formation from being swept out to sea. Piano wire, Maggie. It's nearly invisible and strong enough to slice through skin if someone struggles. It was a gallows humor situation, literally being bound to your coworkers to keep from being reclaimed by the Pacific. Esther was the general of this drowned army. She was the only one with the leverage to demand a break, but she rarely took one. She knew that if she slowed down, the factory stopped. She felt a burden of leadership that was more about production quotas than artistic expression. These women were the Rosie the Riveters of the aquatic set, performing labor that would have broken a professional athlete today.
It's a lot of pressure for a girl next door. I'm starting to see why you call it a crime scene. It's less about art and more about the endurance of the human body under extreme capitalistic demands.
Let's talk about the physics of impact, because this is where the glamour turns into a casualty report. In 1952, during the filming of $1 Million Mermaid, she performed a 50-foot dive wearing a heavy gold-spangled leotard and a massive headpiece. Think about the surface tension of water at that height. It's like hitting concrete. When she hit the water, the weight of the suit, which had absorbed gallons of water instantly, combined with the G-force of the impact, snapped 3 vertebrae in her neck. She described hearing a sound like a dry branch snapping, a sound only she could hear, muffled by the water as she sank toward the bottom, unable to move her limbs, waiting for the safety divers to notice she wasn't resurfacing.
Good God. And the studio? Did they shut down production? Did they realize they'd nearly killed their biggest revenue stream?
Shut down? This was the era of the contract player, Maggie. Human capital. They put her in a body cast for 6 months, a vertical tomb that she had to live in, eat in, and sleep in. And the moment she could stand without collapsing, they put her back in the water. That's the archival reality. The studio didn't see a woman. They saw a highly specialized piece of capital equipment. If the equipment breaks, you weld it back together and restart the assembly line. Every minute that tank sat idle was money bleeding out of the MGM coffers. They didn't even pay her medical bills in full. She had to negotiate for her own survival while her neck was literally being held together by plaster and grit.
It's strange. We grew up hearing about the Golden Age as this era of effortless elegance, where every star was treated like royalty. But you're describing a blood and guts operation. Was she just a victim of the system then? A tragic figure caught in the gears?
Don't make her a victim. That's the simplified narrative I despise, because it robs her of her specific, mercenary intelligence. Esther was a shark. She knew exactly what her aquamusicals were worth. She once famously said she couldn't act, she couldn't sing, and she couldn't dance, but she could swim. She turned a failed Olympic dream, thanks to the 1940 Games being canceled by the war, into a global monopoly. She was the only person in the world who did what she did, and she held that over their heads every time she renegotiated her contract. She was a businesswoman in Sequins, calculating the box office returns with every stroke. She knew that without her, Stage 30 was just a very expensive, empty hole in the ground.
So she was the detective of her own career. She found the one niche where she was untouchable because the barriers to entry were too high for anyone else to follow. It's like she cornered the market on a specific type of suffering.
Exactly. But look at the inventory of the damage that the public never saw. I found the medical logs. Broken eardrums from the pressure of the deep tank dives. Nearly drowning because of malfunctioning trapdoors that wouldn't open under 10 feet of water. And the constant, agonizing eye infections. Do you know about the fog?
The fog?
That's what the swimmers called it. After 10 hours in a heavily chlorinated tank, your corneas actually swell. By the end of the day, Esther would be legally blind for hours, seeing the world through a white, milky haze. She'd have to be led by the hand from the set to her dressing room. And yet, the next morning, she was back in the tank. To keep her eyes looking clear on film, they'd hit her with drops that would constrict the blood vessels, but it did nothing for the pain. They were essentially chemically burning her eyes for the sake of a vibrant blue gaze in Technicolor. It was a trade, her vision for a few minutes of vivid, saturated footage.
And the glow on her skin? Surely that was at least natural.
Baby oil, Maggie. Gallons of it. To keep the water from beading too much on her skin, and to give her that literal superhuman glow, they coated her in a chemical cocktail of oil and sealant. She spent half her life in a blur because the chlorine was so thick she could barely see, and the oil would seep into her pores until she broke out in rashes that had to be covered with even heavier, waterproof makeup, which was essentially lead-based paint at the time. They were literally pickling her in a tank for 12 hours a day. It was industrial preservation, not beauty.
It makes the grace look like a lie. If she's struggling to breathe and blinded by chemicals, that smile in Skirts Ahoy or Easy to Wed isn't an expression of joy. It's a masterpiece of psychological endurance. It's the ultimate poker face. It's the smile or you're fired doctrine of the studio system. It's terrifying, really, when you consider the mental discipline required to suppress a drowning reflex for the sake of a camera angle.
It's a performance of stamina. Consider the costume designers, the real unsung villains of the piece. They weren't making fashion. They were performing nautical engineering. They had to figure out how to keep a silk dress from dragging her to the bottom of the tank like an anchor, or how to keep a sequined crown from becoming a jagged blade upon impact. In Jupiter's Darling, she wore a suit made of metal mesh. Imagine the weight. Imagine the chafing as she moved through the resistance of the water. They even used internal lead weights in the hemlines of the costumes to keep them from floating up. Imagine the risk of being pulled under by your own wardrobe if a clasp got caught. Every sequin was a potential shrapnel wound.
I see a note here about underwater smoke. What on earth is that?
Another MGM innovation. They wanted a dreamlike effect under the water, so they pumped in chemical smoke, carbon tetrachloride mostly. It was toxic, of course. It lingered in the tank and burned the lungs of any swimmer who had to surface for air. They were creating a literal smog in a liquid environment, just for a 30-second sequence of ethereal beauty. Every breath she took was a gamble with her respiratory system. They were quite literally drowning her in atmosphere.
And the romance? Was that as manufactured as the pool temperature? I remember the way she looked at her leading men. It felt so genuine, so much like the post-war American dream.
Even more so. It was a calculated subversion of power. The studio paired her with leading men like Ricardo Montalban, Red Skelton, or Howard Keel, men who often couldn't swim half as well as she could. Imagine the power dynamic, Maggie. In any other film of that era, the man is the protector. In an Esther Williams movie, if the leading man falls into the water, Esther is the only one who can save him. MGM hated that subtext. It threatened the fragile masculinity of the 1940s and 50s. They spent thousands on editing and camera angles just to ensure she didn't look too dominant in her own element. They wanted her to be a mermaid, decorative and mythical, not a superior athlete who could outlast any man on the payroll.
So they were trying to drown her talent even while they were selling it. They wanted the spectacle of her power, but they didn't want the implications of it. It's almost as if they were afraid that if women saw her, they'd realize they could be just as powerful in their own spheres. The water was her domain, and in it, she was the master of everyone.
Exactly. It's the classic Hollywood paradox. Be extraordinary, but don't be threatening. They even controlled her personal life with the same ruthlessness. They dictated when she could marry, when she could have children. When she became pregnant, the studio was furious, not because they cared about her health, but because their equipment was temporarily out of commission. They even tried to force her to have an abortion to keep the filming schedule. She refused, but she was back in the water just weeks after giving birth. By the time the 50s rolled around and the public's taste shifted toward gritty realism and the method acting of Marlon Brando, the studio just stopped. They didn't know what to do with a woman whose primary asset was a swimming tank they no longer wanted to heat. The factory closed, and she was the last item on the shelf.
What happened to the equipment then? Did they just scrap her? It's the typical Hollywood ending, isn't it? The sunset, the fading starlet, the forgotten name in a dusty ledger, perhaps a cameo in a cheap television special about the good old days.
No, Maggie. That's where the detective becomes the magnate. She didn't fade away into a tragic alcoholic haze like so many of her contemporaries who were chewed up by the machine. She took that million-dollar brand and moved into swimming pools and swimwear. She realized that if she was going to be treated like a commodity, she might as well own the warehouse. She sold the lifestyle she had been forced to simulate. She marketed the dream of the backyard pool to a burgeoning middle class, essentially privatizing the spectacle she once provided for the studio.
She turned the $1 Million Mermaid into a $1 billion reality for the American middle class. It's a colonization of the backyard. It's almost as if she said, if I had to suffer in the tank, you're gonna buy one for your kids. She transformed her trauma into the ultimate suburban status symbol.
Precisely. She was the first influencer before the term existed. She taught the American housewife that she could look like a mermaid in her own backyard pool, provided she bought the right brand of Esther Williams approved liner and chlorine. She took the trauma of Stage 30 and turned it into a retail empire. She knew that the dream was a product, and she was the only one with the patent. Even her autobiography was a calculated dismantling of the myth. She titled it The $1 Million Mermaid, and then proceeded to detail every broken bone and betrayal. She reclaimed the narrative by showing exactly how much it cost to maintain.
It changes the way you look at the films. You see the smile, but now I'm looking for the neck brace hidden under the sequins. I'm looking for the athlete who knew her worth in a room full of men who wanted to keep her underwater. It makes the movies feel less like musicals and more like documentaries of survival. Every frame is a miracle of grit, masquerading as grace.
That's the beginning of wisdom, Maggie. History isn't the dance. It's the friction of the shoes against the floor. It's the heat generated by the resistance. Esther Williams wasn't just a girl in a pool. She was a woman who survived a machine that was designed to drown her for a ticket price. And then she had the audacity to sell the machine back to the public for a profit. She turned a gilded cage into a liquid gold mine. She understood that in the end, the only person who can truly keep you afloat is yourself.
Thanks for watching until the end.
Have a good day.
Bye!